Once you've nailed down your exchange requirements, it's time to start modeling them. And we call that exchange content modeling. The idea here is to develop a model that contains all the pieces of information you're going to exchange and shows the relationships between them. Then you'll use that model going forward to map it to the NIEM, but you can also use it as a check against your requirements. It's tempting to think of IEPD development as a linear thing, as you just go straight through, I do my requirements, I do my model, I do my mapping, I make my schemas. But the truth is, as you get further down into the steps, sometimes you find mistakes you made. Sometimes you'll find things you missed. Sometimes you'll find things that are there that shouldn't have been in the requirements, and that will make you go back and revisit earlier steps. So while drawing out an exchange content model is an important step in that it leads into the mapping, it's also an important step in analyzing your requirements from the previous step. And that's true all through this process. At every step, you might find out that you screwed something up earlier and you have to go back and revisit that work. And that's just the nature of it. Now, the idea with the model is to basically map out the content and structure of the exchange. The most common way of doing this is using UML, the Uniform Modeling Language, and a subset of it called class diagrams. In class diagrams, you have classes. Think of those as objects. There's actual chunks, objects in the NIEM. Attributes, now these are not XML attributes, so don't think of them in terms of XML attributes. These are UML attributes, and these are chunks of data about the objects that the classes represent. There are associations linking the different classes together, and then there's cardinality saying how many of one class is associated with how many of the other class. The purpose of doing this modeling is, well, fourfold really. It's to first achieve a formal and precise definition of the exchange content. To do a model like this, you need to sit down and precisely determine what each and every piece of the exchange is and how it fits in with the other pieces. It also produces an artifact that's universally understood and verifiable. Anybody who wants to know what your exchange is about, well, they can look at this diagram and see the actual pieces of it. It also functions as a way to build consensus among exchange stakeholders. A lot of people just don't like looking at huge blocks and reams of text. They'd rather have some sort of graphical design that shows how the pieces fit together. And so having this model helps you build consensus about what should and should not be in the exchange. Finally, it creates a model representing your business content that will be mapped to the NIEM. In other words, you take this piece and it feeds into the next step where you map it to the NIEM itself. Now, this isn't a class on modeling, but there are some guidelines you should keep in mind so that your model turns out pretty good. Number one is cohesion. There should be one class for each concept. In other words, if you have the same concept, you don't want to model it as more than one class per concept. Completeness. It ought to include all of the data requirements. If it doesn't have all the data requirements in it, then it's not really a model of your exchange. Non-redundancy. The same concept should not be modeled more than once. Again, you should have each concept in there once. Enforcement of business rules. To the extent possible, it should accurately reflect the business rules that you have that control your exchange. And then finally, communication. The point of the model, part of it is to serve as an effective tool to support communication among stakeholders. So you want to make sure that it's visually pleasing and that it makes sense to people who look at it. It's possible to draw models that are technically correct, but they're atrociously hard to understand. And if you do that, well, then you haven't done a good model, because part of it is to facilitate that communication. So what should you draw your exchange content model in? Well, you should draw it in UML. UML is a unified modeling language. It's a standardized modeling language that can be represented graphically. You have lots of boxes and arrows and things like that. It's the typical tool used for modeling NIEM exchanges. Now, do you have to use it? No, you don't. You can come up with your own graphical notation if you want to, but there's a problem here. Suppose I came up with TML, Tommy's modeling language, and it's my own graphical way of modeling elements and their relationships between the different objects, things like that. And so I do my exchange content model in TML. Now, the problem is if somebody else takes my TML diagram, well, they won't know what my notation means. They'll have no idea. Maybe it's fairly obvious, maybe not, but they won't know, and they won't have any way other than calling me up to find out just exactly how TML works. If instead you use UML, well, then everybody can find out how it works. Even if somebody doesn't already know UML, there's tons of UML training materials available out there, so they can learn easily what the different things in UML mean, and then they can understand your diagram. So there are really, really, really good benefits to using a standardized language like UML, and so we highly recommend you do so. Now, in the context of making an IEPD, we're concerned mainly with static structure class diagrams in UML. There's a lot more to UML than just class diagrams, but that's what we use for exchange content modeling. One final thing to tell you is that there's something called NIEM UML, which is a UML profile. It's a way of representing NIEM objects and concepts in UML. And the NIEM UML profile then allows you, with the proper tooling, to define your exchanges solely in UML and not have to bother with the XML schema. Please keep in mind that NIEM UML is brand new and has not been widely tested in the community, but it's an exciting development and one that you might want to take a look at.